When I started my course redesign this summer, I knew that I wanted to make my course as fully accessible as possible. This meant that I needed to pay attention to, among other things, color contrast, font style and size, structure, alternative text, and most importantly, captions. Since I really liked the slide-by-slide narration provided in Articulate Presenter, I focused on that for the redesign and spent almost a month struggling with the whole captioning issue in the multiple files produced by Articulate Presenter. Without going into the messy ordeal of using Presenter to produce captioned, narrated PowerPoints, suffice it to say that I wasted a ton of time going nowhere. I tried both Camtasia and Panopto, but was spending an inordinate amount of time not only editing the videos, but also editing the captions. I don't know what it was that led me to check out the recording feature of PowerPoint. Maybe it was the sheer frustration that I was experiencing. But to my delight, the recording function was totally different than I remembered it from years back. Once your PowerPoint is put together, you select Slideshow in the menu and then Record Slideshow. The Record Slideshow environment is different on a PC than a Mac, which I'll illustrate in just a minute. Both the PC and the Mac environment allow you to record one slide at a time. The interface is a little different between the PC and the Mac, but basically you record a slide. If you make a mistake in the narration, you can re-record that slide as many times as necessary. Once you're satisfied with the narration on a slide, you move to the next slide and repeat the process. If after you've narrated all of the slides, you decide that you want to make a change in one or more of the slides, you can go back into the Record Slideshow environment and make whatever changes you desire. After you're satisfied with all of the narrations, you can export the PowerPoint as an MP4. Let me take you first into the PC environment and then the Mac environment to show you how this works. I'm in the Windows environment and I have my PowerPoint ready to narrate. Now this is just a 2-slide PowerPoint. Notice down at the bottom I've included some notes to show you what that looks like in the slide record function. If I'm ready to record, I select Slideshow at the top and then Record Slideshow. That brings up the Windows environment that allows me to record one slide at a time. Notice at the top left there's a record button, a stop button, and a replay button, and those do exactly what you would think that they should do. Notice also at the top there's this little thing that says Notes, and if I click on that, it will bring up the notes that I have attached to a specific slide. Now to me this is the one negative to do with the Windows environment because it's really small. I can include or increase the size by selecting that. But when I do that, it increases the size, but the number of notes that are available is much less. Now I can use the slider to go through it if I really want to. Down at the bottom right is an icon for video if I wanted to include a headshot and the microphone. So now I'm ready to record. I'm going to select the record button and it goes through a countdown. When I started my course redesign this summer, I knew that I wanted to make my course as fully accessible as possible. At this point, I could pause the recording and maybe move the slider down to a different place in the notes. I could just re-record if I knew that at that point I had screwed up and there wasn't any point in going through the end of it. Or I could say stop, and that would indicate that I'm finished recording this slide. If I wanted to, I could go back and re-record the whole thing. I could also replay it to see what it sounded like. Assuming that I'm happy with this slide, over on the right, select the Advance to the next slide, and that takes me to the next slide with exactly the same environment, and I can record that. Once I'm finished with that, advance to the next slide, and there is no next slide. And so now I'm finished recording. If I'm happy with the recording, I can export it. But before doing that, if I'm not happy with it, I can go back into the slide record function and re-record one or more of the slides. To export it as an MP4, I select File, export, and I want to create a video. Now, actually, I think the default that will come up is full high definition 1080p, which I think is really too large a file size, at least for the quality of what I'm doing. So I generally select HD 720p. I select Create Video, and it asks me what I want to name it and where I want to save it. I select Save. And then down at the very bottom, kind of in the center, you can see that the video was being prepared. So that's what the environment is like in Windows, in a Windows PC. Let me go back and do the same thing using a Mac. Now I'm on my Mac with the same 2-slide PowerPoint that I want to narrate. To do that, I select Slideshow, Record Slideshow, and that brings up the Mac environment. Now notice at the top left that as soon as I enter the recording environment, the recording starts, and that's the one thing that I really don't like about the Mac environment. But it's no problem. I want to select Pause, which stops the recording, and then to the right of that I want to select the Rewind button, which takes me back to the beginning of the slide. Notice that not only do I have the current slide, but I also have the next slide. And the one feature that I really like about the Mac environment is that I also have the full text of the notes, not that little drop-down box from the Windows environment. Down at the bottom, I've got the 2 slides. If I had more slides, they would be displayed down at the bottom. And below the current slide, I have a forward and a backward button to move backwards and forward through the slides. When I'm ready to record, I select the right arrow, which is the record button in the Mac environment, and I go through and do the narration of the slide. When I'm finished narrating, I select Pause, which stops the recording, and at this point I can do one of 2 things. I can decide that I'm happy with the narration and move to the next slide, or I can rewind to the beginning and re-record that slide. Assuming that I'm happy with the narration, I move forward to the next slide. And again, notice that the recording starts immediately. I want to stop that. I press pause and rewind, and that takes me to the beginning of the next slide. I go through and do the narration of the next slide. If I'm happy with it, I move to the next slide. If I'm not, I can re-record it, and so on and so forth. So once I've finished narrating, I'm back in PowerPoint, and I want to produce it as an MP4, assuming that I'm happy with the narration. Now, if I wasn't happy with the narration, I could go back into Slideshow and record Slideshow and re-record one or more of the slides. But to produce it as an MP4, I select File, Export. The file format that I want is MP4. And the quality that I want is internet quality. There's no point in doing the 1080p, which is the presentation quality. I select Export, and that goes through and it exports the presentation as an MP4. Now that you have the MP4 of the narrated PowerPoint, the next step, if desired, is creating a caption file to add to the video. I'm going to go through 5 different ways to do this. Automatic captions in Panopto, automatic captions in YouTube, using a prepared transcript, manual entry, and a combination of Dragon Naturally Speaking and YouTube.